Okay, we're going to spend a little time talking about the landing gear assembly on this aircraft. The 41-inch Edge uses spring steel wire landing gear. We're going to assemble this into the aircraft using epoxy glue. Now in this video you're going to see me using a really nice 3M epoxy gun, but the epoxy that comes out of here is still two-part epoxy like you get at the grocery store or the Walmart or the hobby store, and you can use the epoxy that you get at any of those places. 5-minute epoxy works fine. 30-minute epoxy is a little bit stronger, but you have to manage it a little more to make sure it doesn't flow somewhere that you don't want it to. 5-minute epoxy is preferred for this operation. Now we're going to be using the epoxy to glue the wire into the fuselage, to glue the wood brace behind the wire. We're also going to be using the epoxy to strengthen the wheel pants on the interior, and then we're also going to use the epoxy to glue our landing gear fairings to our wire landing gear. Now, there's one more thing we're going to do, because this airplane needs to have the strongest landing gear possible, because a lot of people are going to be using this to learn 3D, and they're going to be using this to learn to land 3D aircraft. We're also going to put epoxy into the fuselage right here on the landing gear mount down at the bottom. We'll be putting our epoxy in through this hole and through this hole in the battery tray, and what we're doing is we're locking the landing gear mount assembly together to these plates, which you can feel on the fuselage. These are plates here, and we're going to lock the landing gear mount into it with some epoxy down on each side. Alright, let's get started. Okay, for the first step on our landing gear assembly, we're going to take our hobby knife and we're going to remove the covering over the landing gear mounting hole. Careful of your fingers, never cut towards exposed skin. And we'll get all that covering out of the way. Okay. Alright, so there's our slot in the bottom of the fuselage, and we're going to be putting our landing gear in there. Let's trial fit it with no glue and make sure that everything goes together properly. Okay, so we take our landing gear, we insert the landing gear into the fuselage, and it snaps in place because the landing gear is pointed and the interior of the slot is pointed. You can feel it go together and it finds a stable location. Find that spot. That's where you're going to want to put your landing gear once you have the glue in the slot. Okay, as we mentioned, we're going to put some epoxy inside the fuselage on the landing gear mount. Like I said, we're using a 3M epoxy gun. This is a really nice hobby tool, but if you don't have one, a popsicle stick works great for applying epoxy in tight spaces. And we're just placing epoxy around the edges of the landing gear mount. And you really can't use too much. If you see a seam here, a little bit of epoxy will help to strengthen the landing gear mount, because we want a very strong mount so that we can bounce the plane hard on its spring steel landing gear without having any problems with our wood joints. You can also do this job with Gorilla Glue, but epoxy stays where you put it and doesn't foam up, so we prefer to use epoxy. Okay? Now, we've done the interior joints. We're going to turn this over, and we're going to apply epoxy into the slot where our landing gear goes. We're going to insert the landing gear. Okay, a little bit of epoxy squeezed out. I'll show you how to clean that up in a second. First, we're going to apply a little more epoxy into the slot. And we're going to insert our plywood triangle lock. And this is going to hold our landing gear in place. Okay, push that as far as it will go. Alright. Now let me show you how to clean up that spilled epoxy. We're going to take regular rubbing alcohol, soak it onto a towel, and we're just going to wipe that epoxy up. Until epoxy is cured, it cleans up very well with regular rubbing alcohol. So anywhere we find epoxy, we'll just wipe it off. Alright. Okay, our landing gear is mounted. We'll give this plywood triangle one final push and make sure that it's fully seated. Now, the pressure from the plywood triangle has caused some small wrinkles in our covering, but we already know how to handle that. Once this assembly is completely dry, we can take our heat gun and shrink those right out. Operation here on our wheel pant. These wheel pants are going to take a lot of abuse. Now, we use a plywood stiffening plate inside the wheel pant, and this is glued to the fiberglass of the wheel pant, but we want this to be absolutely as strong as possible. So we're also going to place some epoxy glue on the front and back edge of our plywood plate inside our wheel pant. Okay, we'll just do that to the other one. Again, we're using the 3M epoxy gun, which is a fantastic tool, but a popsicle stick works very well for getting glue into tight places. Okay, if you look inside, you can see we've got glue on the front and the back edge of the plywood plate. And on really rough surfaces, rocks, dirt, tall grass, this is going to keep your wheel pants alive and attached to the airplane a lot longer. It's a good idea. And now we'll let these wheel pants cure. And once the landing gear assembly itself is cured, we'll go on to the next step. Okay, so our epoxy is cured, and now we're going to go on to the rest of the landing gear assembly. We're first going to take our wheel pant, and you can see the hole in the wheel pant where the landing gear wire has to go. So we want to make sure that the hole is large enough for the landing gear wire to easily go in. So if we need to open it up a little bit, we just take our X-Acto knife, we just spin it around right inside, just like that. Makes an effective little drill when we need it to. And we'll get that to the right size so it pushes easily onto the landing gear wire. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to work inside the wheel pant for the rest of the assembly of the wheel collars and the wheel. We're going to be using a 1.5 millimeter hex driver tool to drive the 1.5 millimeter hex set screws in the wheel collars. What we're going to do is we're going to use our tool to unscrew the set screw so that we have a clear path inside the wheel collar, and we're going to slip this over the wire inside the wheel pant. Now we have one wheel collar inside the wheel pant. Now we're going to take our wheel and we're going to slip it over the wire inside the wheel pant. Now we're going to take our second collar and we're going to put it over the wire inside the wheel pant. We have to make sure this is unscrewed enough so there's a clear path through the wheel collar. I failed to do that. Now it all is working. Okay? And we're just going to put a real quick, just a very light tightening on the outside one so that everything doesn't fall off while we're working. And now we can go on to the next step.